You sit in the soft cushions of an Ottoman coffee house, somewhere in 16th century Istanbul. The air is thick with the scent of roasted beans, smoke from nargile pipes, and the low murmur of poetry recitations. No raised voices, no political chants, just men and ideas sitting still with steaming cups in hand. It feels peaceful, but beneath the silence is a revolution, a bitter one brewed one cup at a time. The story of the Ottoman coffee ban isn't about a dramatic battle or a sweeping revolution. It is, instead, a story of banality, of taxes, trade routes, suspicious sultans, and the unbearable audacity of men sitting too long at cafes. And of course, the uncomfortable truth that people didn't stop drinking coffee even when it was banned. Coffee's arrival, a foreign bean in a suspicious court. Coffee didn't originate in the Ottoman Empire. It came from the highlands of Ethiopia, passed into the hands of Yemeni merchants, and crossed the Red Sea into the Islamic world by the 15th century. Sufi mystics were early adopters, using the brew to stay alert during long night prayers. By the early 1500s, it had spread to Mecca, Cairo, and then to Istanbul, the beating heart of the Ottoman world. In the city once called Constantinople, coffee found its natural home. Traders brought sacks of beans through the bustling port. Cafes sprang up quickly in Istanbul, known as kahvehane. They weren't just places to drink coffee, they were cultural crucibles. Men came to talk literature, play chess, read aloud, and debate news. These were not wild places. They were, in fact, often too quiet. But for the Ottoman authorities, the quiet was more unnerving than comforting. Why the authorities were nervous? In most empires, power hates what it can't control. Coffee houses became places where no guards were stationed, where no sermons were read, and where the Sultan's eyes couldn't see. And yet everyone talked. Unlike mosques, these kahvehanes were spaces for open expression, a radical concept in a court that valued loyalty, silence, and hierarchy. Gossip about imperial policies, mocking verses about viziers, and subtle critiques of the Sultan himself could percolate slowly in these shadowy, lamplit corners. Even more troubling, the people didn't leave quickly. They sat for hours, unmoving, listening, plotting. The first bans, coffee as a threat to order. The earliest formal crackdown came under Sultan Murad III in the late 16th century. The reasoning: coffee was declared intoxicating. In Islamic jurisprudence, anything that alters the mind could fall under the category of haram, forbidden. Coffee's stimulating effects gave religious scholars just enough room to wiggle into legal condemnation. The real fear, of course, wasn't that men were getting too awake, but that they were becoming too aware. Sharia scholars, under pressure from the palace, began to deliver fatwas against coffee consumption. Some claimed it caused illness or stoked rebellion. Others simply argued it promoted idleness. A society of sedentary men was a dangerous one, especially if they all had opinions. Coffee executions and surveillance. Things took a darker turn under Sultan Murad IV, R 1623-1640. Known for his iron-fisted rule, Murad IV sought to impose moral order across his empire. He banned alcohol, tobacco, and coffee. All were seen as disruptive indulgences, though coffee's connection to dissent made it uniquely dangerous. Murad disguised himself to walk the streets of Istanbul, personally enforcing the ban. He reportedly executed violators with his own hands, a grim demonstration of how serious the prohibition was. A man caught sipping coffee might find himself beheaded in the square, beside others who had been caught drinking wine or smoking hashish. It was not a symbolic ban. It was enforced with the full weight of imperial power. And yet the coffeehouses stayed open. Why the ban failed spectacularly? Despite the brutality of the crackdown, people did not stop drinking coffee. Coffee vendors went underground literally. Secret kahvehanes opened in basements, behind butcher stalls, or in the backs of bookstores. Patrons entered through hidden alleys and used coded language. the act of drinking coffee became not just pleasurable but defiant. Even janissaries, the elite soldiers of the Sultan, were known to frequent illegal coffee houses. Some ran them. The public stubbornness wasn't just about caffeine addiction. It was about space. The Kavihane was one of the only places where a man could be more than a subject. He could be a speaker, a thinker, a critic. And that wasn't something people gave up easily, even under threat of death. Coffee as a symbol of autonomy. The more the empire tried to stamp it out, the more symbolic coffee became. It was no longer a beverage. It was a flag of the people, a steaming, bitter symbol of civilian independence. By the 18th century, coffee was not only tolerated, it was celebrated. The bans had failed so completely that they were rarely enforced anymore. Cafes returned to public life, with poets, preachers, merchants, and yes, spies among their regular clientele. Still, the legacy of those bans remains. The Ottoman state's failure to crush coffee culture shows a subtle, often overlooked truth. People will always find ways to reclaim quiet power, especially when the revolution is brewed slowly in porcelain cups. A final sip for now. So here we are. One of the largest empires in history tried to outlaw a bean and failed. But the story doesn't end with Sultan Murad or his sword. The deeper tale lies in what happened after the coffee bans eased. What happened when coffee became legal again? Did it change the empire, or did the empire change coffee? A legal beverage in an unsettled empire. The sun rose slowly on a post-ban Istanbul, but the scent of coffee no longer needed to hide behind butcher stalls or bookstore walls. As the Ottoman authorities loosened their grip, whether from exhaustion or inevitability, Kavihane culture flourished again, emerging stronger, deeper, and even more politically potent than before. Though no grand proclamation announced the end of the bans, by the late 17th century, enforcement had waned. Murad IV had died. His successors, less concerned with moral purity and more focused on military affairs and European diplomacy, chose not to reignite the feudal war on coffee. And just like that, the Ottomans entered the world of legal coffee consumption. But they didn't merely drink it, they lived it. The Kavihane as a social machine. To understand the new Ottoman coffee house, you must forget the modern idea of a cafe. There were no laptops, no jazz music, no casual sipping between errands. Ottoman coffee houses were social engines, sometimes sacred, often scandalous, always central. They were typically simple in structure: wide rooms with thick carpets, low seating, and walls decorated with calligraphy, maps, and shadow puppets. The brewing station, or seive, was usually at the back, where a skilled barista could boil the coffee 3 times in a copper pot without letting it spill over. But it was the clientele that made the Kavihane important. Artisans, students, merchants, clerks, and soldiers filled the spaces. It was a place where the shoemaker could debate tax policies with a retired imam, or a janissary could swap rumors with a traveling storyteller. Few other public venues allowed such cross-class interaction. The cafe was, quite literally, the only place where the empire spoke to itself. Coffee and the birth of Ottoman public opinion. As the 18th century unfolded, coffee houses began shaping what today we might call public opinion. Newspapers were still a rarity, and many citizens were illiterate, but oral news culture flourished. Every major event passed through the filter of the Kavihane. War, you heard it in a cafe before you heard it from the state. New tax. The baker's cousin's neighbor probably shared the news while sipping dark, bitter brew. Corruption scandal in the palace. Someone with a connection to the janissaries had something to say loudly. This was how information traveled in a pre-bureaucratic world. The state noticed and worried. Though the bans were technically lifted, surveillance didn't disappear. Spies were a known feature of many Istanbul coffeehouses, scribes planted by the Sultan's muberler, or informers, tasked with monitoring conversations. It was the equivalent of today's comment section data scraping, but slower and more dangerous. Still, people talked and gossiped and joked and played chess while doing it. Coffeehouse specialties, games, puppets, and poetry. Not all coffeehanes were created equal. Some were devoted to poetry readings and divan literature, high Ottoman verse filled with allegory and metaphor. These attracted students and aspiring court poets who practiced subtle, coded critique of the Sultan and his viziers. Others specialized in Karagör's shadow puppet plays. Originally intended as light entertainment, these became venues for satire and parody, poking fun at bureaucrats, clerics, and foreigners alike. Some historians consider the puppet stage to be one of the earliest platforms for political satire in the Muslim world. Chess and backgammon were played constantly. The rules of the game never changed, but the metaphors did. Pawns as peasants, kings as tyrants. Sometimes the game became a language all its own. And then there were storytellers, or meta. These performers memorized epic poems, historical tales, and religious legends, but their stories adapted over time. What began as ancient fables could easily morph into allegories for present-day injustice, thinly veiled critiques that everyone in the room understood. The coffeehouse had become a theater of subtle resistance, and all of it was washed down with a dark, oily brew served in tiny porcelain cups. The European view of Ottoman coffee culture. While the Ottomans embraced the social chaos of coffee, European travelers observed with a mix of fascination and alarm. Many were stunned by how central the beverage and the café was to Ottoman life. In 1675, the English traveler John Covell remarked, "The Turks spend 6 hours a day at least in the coffeehouses, discoursing, not laboring." This wasn't a compliment. To European merchants and diplomats, the coffeehouse looked like a place of idle chatter and dangerous thinking. They weren't entirely wrong, but they were missing something deeper. These were the only truly horizontal spaces in a deeply vertical empire. Still, the European obsession with Ottoman coffee culture didn't end in criticism. It transformed into imitation. The spread of coffee from empire to empire. Thanks in part to Ottoman influence, coffeehouses spread across Europe. The first ones in Venice and Vienna took direct inspiration from Istanbul's kahvehanes. The furniture, the rituals, even the way coffee was served all had Ottoman DNA. But in Europe, the coffeehouse became more intellectual, less theatrical. Where the Ottomans had puppet plays and oral poetry, the French and British coffeehouses leaned toward pamphlets and periodicals. Yet the principle remained the same. People gathered, talked, argued, and stayed awake. The Ottomans had brewed a legacy that would stretch far beyond their own borders, even as they struggled to contain it at home. Coffee and the fall of the Janissaries. One of the most ironic twists in this story is the role of coffeehouses in the decline of the Janissaries, the elite imperial guard once feared and respected across the empire. By the late 18th century, the Janissaries had grown corrupt and politically dangerous. They used coffeehouses as centers of power, not just rest. They extorted cafe owners, staged rebellions, and plotted coups from the very spaces they once patrolled. In 1826, Sultan Mahmud II finally disbanded the Janissaries in what came to be known as the Auspicious Incident. Many of the Janissary coffeehouses were closed, raided, or burned, but the coffee itself, it stayed. This was another pattern of Ottoman coffee history. Rulers might succeed in suppressing the people who used the coffeehouse for power, but never the beverage or the space itself. Coffee endured, quietly like always. The cup deepens. By the 19th century, coffee had been normalized, even ritualized into daily Ottoman life. Engagements were proposed over coffee, disputes settled with it, friendships rekindled by it, political ideas floated in steam. But behind this normalization was a deeper story. A once-banned drink had become the soul of a civilization, not by state decree, not by religious fatwa, but by sheer human insistence on having a space to gather, speak, and stay awake together. Still, questions remain. What happened when the empire finally collapsed in the 20th century? Did the coffee houses survive the fall of the sultans? And what did the modern Turkish state do with this centuries-old tradition? Empire in decline, culture in motion. As the 19th century wore on, the Ottoman Empire became known as the sick man of Europe. It was losing territories, struggling with debt, and facing internal revolts. Railways and telegraphs brought new ideas and faster descent. Western reforms seeped into the bureaucratic cracks of a once rigidly theocratic world. And yet, even amid political instability and territorial losses, the coffeehouse held its ground. If anything, it grew stronger. In cities like Istanbul, Izmir, Damascus, and Salonika, the kahvehane remained one of the few constants in a rapidly shifting world. People still gathered under dim lanterns, shared strong, cardamom-infused brews, and whispered or shouted about the crumbling world outside. As sultans rose and fell, the coffee stayed hot. A new kind of coffeehouse, political and printed. By the late 1800s, a shift began. The Ottoman world was entering its final century, and modernity was knocking not gently. The old coffeehouses, where poetry and puppet plays once ruled, began to give way to new spaces of expression. Cafes where printed newspapers were read aloud, where revolutionaries discussed constitutionalism, and where secular intellectuals mingled with religious scholars, not always peacefully. These were the golden days of the young Ottomans, and later the young Turks, reformist and revolutionary groups pushing for a modern, constitutional empire. Many of their meetings were held in back rooms of cafes, disguised as game nights or storytelling sessions. As printing technology advanced, cafes began to stock daily and weekly papers. Literacy increased. The coffeehouse became a school for adults, a place to hear the news, interpret it, and form opinions. A slow, caffeinated awakening. The same structure that once terrified Sultan Murad IV now fostered political literacy. It was no longer a threat to the state, it was a platform for creating a new one. War collapse and the end of the empire. World War I accelerated the end. The Ottoman Empire, siding with the Central Powers, was torn apart by defeat, occupation, and civil unrest. By 1922, the Sultanate was abolished. In 1923, the Republic of Turkey was born under Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. With the empire dissolved, many Ottoman traditions were swept aside. Fez hats were banned. Arabic script was replaced with Latin letters. Islamic courts were dismantled. The goal was clear: modernize and secularize, move westward, move fast. But the coffeehouse remained. Even amid Atatürk's sweeping reforms, the cafe stayed relevant. In fact, it adapted rapidly. New coffeehouses in Republican Turkey resembled European cafes with tall windows, printed menus, even marble counters. But they still served Turkish coffee, thick, unfiltered, and brewed in a sieve. The preparation didn't change. The conversation did. Coffee in a republic, continuity and reinvention. Post-Ottoman cafes became gathering places for journalists, university students, politicians, and labor organizers. The tradition of storytelling was replaced with political debate and the reading of news aloud. Instead of shadow puppets, there were political cartoons. Instead of oral poems, there were satirical essays passed from hand to hand. The Republic embraced the coffeehouse not as an Ottoman relic, but as a platform for building civic culture. In rural villages, the local kahvehane remained a place for gossip, debate, and backgammon. In cities, it became a salon of sorts, quieter, but just as vital. Many of the founding members of the Turkish parliament in their youth had spent long hours in such cafes, hearing whispers of revolution over steaming cups. The Kavahane had changed costumes, but not its soul. The global spread of a local ritual. By the mid-20th century, Turkish coffee was a known global product. It was brewed in Greece, albeit with a different name, in Armenia, in the Balkans, in parts of the Arab world, and even in diaspora communities across Europe and North America. Every version had its own quirks: the sweetness level, the cardamom, the grind. But the method remained largely unchanged. Fine grounds, copper pot, slow boil, no filter. The result: a sludgy, rich drink at the bottom of a tiny porcelain cup. But here's the strange twist: in the age of Starbucks, espresso, and cold brews, the humble Turkish coffee still survives. In fact, in 2013, UNESCO recognized Turkish coffee as an intangible cultural heritage of humanity, a global nod to a centuries-old tradition, once considered dangerous enough to be punished by death. Reflections in the coffee grounds. Today, in modern Istanbul, you can still walk into a kahvehane. You'll find older men playing cards, young men arguing over politics, and someone pouring thick coffee into small cups with practiced ease. The ban is long gone, the fear has faded, but the tradition remains. In the swirling grounds left at the bottom of the cup, fortune tellers still read fates. But history reads something else: a record of survival. Not just of a drink, but of a public space, a way of speaking, and the stubborn resilience of daily life. Coffee was never just coffee. It was defiance, dialogue, and dignity, all served in a cup no bigger than your palm. Final thoughts: the ban that brewed a culture. What began as a state panic over idle men sitting too long together became one of the Ottoman Empire's greatest cultural legacies. The attempt to control conversation failed spectacularly. Instead, the coffeehouse became the very place where empires unraveled, republics were imagined, and identities were debated. And it all happened slowly, sip by sip, in dimly lit rooms, between long silences and short bursts of poetry. A failed ban, a bean too stubborn to stay buried, and a history too boring to be anything but true. Next time on Boring History for Sleep, we turn from the bitterness of coffee to the cooing chaos of pigeons, as we explore the strange and bureaucratically tedious world of postal pigeons in empires that couldn't afford stamps. A bird in the bureaucracy. Imagine a quiet, dust-blown hill somewhere in the ancient Mediterranean world. The year is uncertain, perhaps 2,500 years ago. A small, cloth-wrapped message is tied to the leg of a gray bird. A man lifts his arm. The bird flutters briefly and then takes off, disappearing into the hot blue sky. No horns are blown. No fanfare announces its departure. And yet, that pigeon may carry news of war, birth, rebellion, or taxes across mountains, rivers, and cities faster than any human could on foot or horseback. The history of homing pigeons is not romantic, nor particularly glamorous. It is logistical, boring, even. But within that boredom lies a critical artery in the body of ancient and pre-modern states. This is not the story of birds in myths or omens. This is the story of birds as bureaucrats. The basics, how it surprisingly works. Before we get lost in dusty archives and imperial pigeon lofts, we must answer the most common question: how does a pigeon know where to go? The answer is frustratingly simple. It doesn't go somewhere, it returns. Homing pigeons are trained to fly back to a specific home loft. If you raise a pigeon in Baghdad and move it to Aleppo, it will instinctively fly back to Baghdad when released, even if it's never flown that route before. That one-way limitation made pigeons perfect for outbound messaging from key locations. It meant that outposts, forts, or moving armies could send urgent information back to capital cities or central command, as long as the pigeons had been previously raised in those locations. Empires learned to maintain elaborate loft systems and plan their pigeon deployments carefully, not unlike military supply chains. For every message to be sent, The bird had to be raised at the receiving end, cared for, transported, and released with the correct message. Tedious, absolutely, but surprisingly effective. Ancient origins: the Egyptians, Persians, and Greeks. Pigeon messaging likely began in ancient Egypt. Pigeons were sacred animals associated with the goddess Hathor, but beyond their religious significance, the Egyptians noticed their navigational abilities. Some scholars believe that messages often involving grain prices or harvest yields were dispatched between cities like Thebes and Memphis. But it was the Persian Empire, with its famously efficient royal road system, that truly embraced the idea of rapid communication. While most historians remember the mounted couriers of the royal road, Xenophon writes of messages moving faster than fire. Pigeons may have been used as well, especially for fort-to-capital alerts, where horsemen would take too long. The Greeks used pigeons in more creative ways. During the Olympic Games in ancient times, pigeons were released to announce victors to their home cities. This was both a political and cultural move, boosting morale and asserting civic pride all via bird. But it was in Hellenistic and Roman times that pigeon post began edging into formal administration. Rome and the Pigeon Gap. Despite its vast bureaucracy, Rome never fully adopted pigeons as a primary messaging system. Some Roman writers, including Pliny the Elder, reference pigeons used for military purposes and message delivery, especially during sieges. But pigeons were seen as supplemental to Rome's extensive system of mounted couriers and way stations, cursus publicus. Why did Rome embrace the pigeon more fully? Likely because it didn't need to. With paved roads, relay stations, and an enslaved population capable of transporting letters, Rome simply had other means. Pigeons were used but never institutionalized. The real pigeon renaissance wouldn't arrive until the Islamic Golden Age, when empire met avian innovation. The Islamic world's postal birds. Between the 8th and 13th centuries, the Islamic caliphates, particularly the Abbasids, developed a robust communication system, blending Persian, Greek, and Indian logistical knowledge. This system, known as the Barid, included mounted couriers and message runners, but also homing pigeons. Records from Baghdad suggest that caliphs maintained pigeon lofts in major cities and along trade routes. Pigeons were used not just for urgent military messages, but also for scholarly communication, a reflection of the Abbasid focus on knowledge transmission. And it was during this period that an important shift occurred. Breeding and pigeon science became state interests. Manuals were written on pigeon care, feeding, and training. Lofts were constructed with domed rooftops, and handlers were given official posts. The pigeon was no longer just a bird, it was infrastructure. Medieval messaging: Cairo, Aleppo, and the Mamluks. In Cairo, under the Fatimids and later the Mamluks, pigeons were central to military surveillance. Armies marching into Syria would carry trained birds with them and release updates back to Egyptian cities. Conversely, border forts maintained birds raised in Cairo to dispatch warnings of invasions or raids. One report from the 13th century recounts that a message traveled from Aleppo to Cairo nearly 500 miles in just one day by pigeon. A mounted messenger might have taken 3. Such speed was not common. Most pigeons averaged around 50-60 km/h and could fly up to 600 miles in a day under ideal conditions. Still, the fact that such a passive creature could outperform a horse over long distances reshaped how medieval states handled emergencies. Pigeons under siege. Sieges were where pigeon messaging truly shone. In a city under siege, roads were blocked, messengers captured, and communication severed. But a pigeon, if hidden and launched at the right moment, could slip past enemy lines and deliver updates to allies or central command. There are accounts of Crusader-era Muslim cities using pigeons to alert neighboring strongholds. Some pigeons were even trained to fly at night, a dangerous but occasionally successful gambit. Of course, enemies learned quickly. Falcons were trained to intercept pigeons mid-flight. Some generals even released false messages attached to captured birds, creating confusion among the defenders. It was a game of wings and wits, all over tiny scraps of parchment tied to a bird's foot. The rise of the Ottoman avian bureaucracy. By the time the Ottoman Empire absorbed much of the Islamic world in the 15th century, pigeon messaging had become highly institutionalized. The Ottomans inherited and refined the practice, using pigeons extensively in military and administrative communication. Sultan Bayezid II and later Suleiman, the Magnificent, reportedly maintained pigeon relays from the Balkans to the Arabian Peninsula. Important documents sealed and marked were carried by select birds known for their reliability. Loft managers were given titles and salaries. Some larger cities had government-funded pigeon houses next to postal relay centers. It was, quite literally, an empire with birds on payroll. The Ottomans, masters of long-distance governance, used pigeons to knit together far-flung territories not just during wars, but also for mundane matters like tax collection notices, weather alerts, and plague reports. A pigeon in every pot, not quite. Despite the sophistication of these systems, pigeons were still limited by biology and weather. They couldn't carry much, messages were small, sometimes only a few words. They could be lost to hawks, fatigue, or storms, and they only flew one way back to their home loft. This required immense planning. For every forward movement of troops or bureaucrats, a team had to bring pre-raised pigeons along in cages. Lofts had to be clean, familiar, and welcoming to ensure the bird would return. In short, the system worked, but only because it was obsessively maintained. Still, it was a marvel of pre-modern logistics, a system built on instinct, reinforced by bureaucracy, and held together by feather and parchment. The slow decline. By the 19th century, pigeons were still in use, particularly in Egypt, Persia, and among tribal communities in North Africa and the Levant. But newer technologies loomed. The telegraph and later the telephone rendered pigeons obsolete. Wires didn't need to eat, sleep, or be carried in cages. By the time World War I arrived, pigeon use was mostly symbolic, though, ironically, the Great War would give these birds one last heroic encore, which we'll explore in the next section. Still, the age of pigeon bureaucracy, of dusty lofts and wrinkled messages, was nearing its end. But what happened in the 20th century? Could pigeons really compete with Morse code, radio, and cables? And why were they still being sent into war zones decades after their empire-building days were over? The last of the old messengers. The 19th century was not kind to messengers on wings. Railways crisscrossed continents, steamships closed the gap between empires, and the electric telegraph rendered many traditional communication systems obsolete. In 1844, the first long-distance telegraph message was sent in the United States. What hath God wrought? What God wrought, apparently, was the slow retirement of the pigeon. And yet, even as wires buzzed and cables stretched across seas, militaries and governments kept their pigeons. Why? Because wires can be cut, radios can be jammed, humans can be captured, but a pigeon quietly released from a battlefield trench or hidden in a jacket could still fly home with a message, even through bullets and bombs. As the old empires fell and new world wars loomed, the pigeon was called into service once more. The Franco-Prussian War and the Siege of Paris, 1870–1871. One of the most iconic uses of pigeons in modern warfare came during the Franco-Prussian War. When the Prussian army besieged Paris in 1870, the French government found itself cut off. Roads, railways, and telegraph lines were severed. How could the rest of France, let alone the world, learn what was happening in the capital? The answer: pigeons. Paris had already trained and maintained carrier pigeons as a backup system, but in this case, they were flown out of Paris by balloon carried over enemy lines to friendly territory. From there, messages were sent back to Paris via pigeons trained to return to their lofts inside the city. But here's the twist: the messages were microfilmed. Using newly developed photographic techniques, entire pages of writing were shrunk onto thin films no bigger than a fingernail and wrapped around the pigeon's legs. Each pigeon carried hundreds of messages at once. Once back in Paris, the microfilm was magnified and printed. Between September 1870 and January 1871, over 150,000 official dispatches were sent into Paris by pigeon. It was the first widespread use of pigeons and photography in combination, and an astonishing logistical feat. The pigeons had helped keep a besieged city in contact with its country. Again, quietly and without ceremony, they had performed the impossible. The World Wars feathered veterans. Despite enormous advances in communication by the 20th century, both World War I and II saw pigeons return to service, often outperforming newer technologies under battlefield conditions. World War I. During the First World War, trench warfare made traditional communication unreliable. Wires were constantly broken by shelling. Couriers were killed or captured. Wireless radio was still new and easily intercepted. So pigeons were deployed, thousands of them. The British, French, German, and American armies all maintained pigeon services. Birds were often housed in mobile lofts and carried by soldiers into the front lines. Messages were written on thin slips of paper, sealed in metal capsules and strapped to their legs. Some birds became famous. Perhaps the most legendary was Cher Ami, a pigeon serving with the U.S. Army Signal Corps in 1918. During the Meuse-Argonne offensive, a unit of American soldiers, the Lost Battalion, was surrounded and being bombed by friendly fire. Their only hope, a pigeon named Cher Ami. She flew 25 miles in 25 minutes, despite being shot through the chest, blinded in one eye and having a leg nearly severed. She survived. The message got through. The shelling stopped. The men were rescued. Cher Ami was awarded the Croix de Guerre, treated by Army medics, and taxidermied after her death. She now rests in the Smithsonian Institution. World War II. In the Second World War, pigeons were still vital. The British established the National Pigeon Service, which supplied over 250,000 pigeons to military units. Many were used during the D-Day invasion, where paratroopers released birds behind enemy lines to confirm landings and transmit early intelligence. One of the most secretive uses of pigeons came from My-14D, a division of British intelligence. They dropped pigeons behind enemy lines in occupied France, with message capsules and small instruction forms asking local civilians to report on troop movements, weather, and morale. Civilians would tie replies to the pigeons and release them, providing critical intel without radio transmissions. Germany, too, used pigeons and trained falcons to intercept enemy birds. In one instance, during the Battle of Arnhem, a pigeon named William of Orange carried a message over 250 miles, leading to the rescue of over 2,000 British troops. He was awarded the Dickin Medal, the animal equivalent of the Victoria Cross. Governments that still paid pigeons. Post-war, some governments continued to fund pigeon programs into the 1950s and even the 60s. The French, British, American, and Indian armies all kept active lofts. The Indian Army's pigeon service was officially disbanded only in 2002, with one bird named Gunga honored in a full military ceremony. Why the long delay? Because in rugged, mountainous terrain like the Himalayas, even satellites sometimes fail. Pigeons, once again, proved to be reliable in places technology couldn't reach. Beyond war, Financial and commercial pigeon messaging. Oddly, pigeons were not limited to war zones. In the 19th century, stock traders in Europe used pigeons to move prices between markets. One famous case was the Rothschild family, who reportedly used pigeons to carry news of Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo to London, before official dispatches arrived, giving them a critical market advantage. The Reuters news agency began as a pigeon messaging service in the 1850s, bridging the gap between Aachen and Brussels until the telegraph was fully connected. Even after telegraph wires spread, some remote areas still used pigeons into the 20th century to carry. Market prices for crops. Lottery numbers. Election results. Love letters occasionally. In each case, the pigeon was faster, quieter, and harder to intercept than many human alternatives. Pigeons in Cold War plans. Even as rockets and computers defined the Cold War, pigeons appeared in classified U.S. military documents. In the 1970s, the CIA briefly explored using pigeons to carry miniature cameras for aerial photography missions. One project, dubbed Project Takana, trained pigeons to fly over Soviet installations and take automated snapshots, essentially creating living spy drones. It was never widely deployed, but the mere fact it was considered speaks volumes. No matter how advanced technology became, pigeons kept fluttering around the edge of possibility, humble, biological backdoors in a world of machines. The fall of the feathered messenger. By the late 20th century, even the most rugged militaries had phased out pigeons. Satellite communications, GPS, and encrypted radio rendered them unnecessary. In 2006, Belgium, once home to one of the world's finest pigeon breeding cultures, closed its last military pigeon center. Similar closures followed in France, China, and India. Lofts were emptied, uniforms retired, and with no ceremony the era ended. Still, pigeon racing remained a popular hobby, especially in Belgium, the UK, and parts of Asia. Birds trained for distance, speed, and loyalty, no longer for war or state, but for sport. A final message still in flight. Even today, stories occasionally surface. A lost homing pigeon found in Canada with wartime-era leg bands. An old man in a dusty village still caring for a dozen birds raised for messaging. A rusty message capsule unearthed in France with faded words from a century past. The pigeon left little behind: no archives, no official logbooks, no medals except for a few exceptional birds. Its legacy is largely invisible, but for centuries, empires, armies, and ordinary people relied on these birds as their fastest, most faithful connection to the outside world. What happens when a message is delivered, but the messenger is forgotten? What does it mean to build a civilization on systems we no longer remember? What remains when the wings are clipped? The pigeon messaging systems that once served emperors, caliphs, generals, and besieged cities are now relics. The lofts are gone, the uniforms packed away, and most of the birds, if they exist at all, are in racing coops, not government registers. There is no grand monument to these birds. No pigeon war memorials stand in the heart of Paris or Cairo. Most of their stories have been reduced to footnotes, trivia, or faded war museum placards. And yet, for much of human history, these birds were part of the machinery of governance and war. So what exactly do we do with this legacy? How do we reconcile a world that once relied on animals for critical infrastructure with our modern view of history as a purely human project? The pigeon, as it turns out, raises questions that are much larger than its size. Forgetting the feathered infrastructure. Every great civilization builds infrastructure: roads, aqueducts, wires, data cables. But not all infrastructure is made of stone and steel. Some of it is soft, breathing, alive. The pigeon messaging system was infrastructure in its most intimate form, biological, mobile, and domesticated. It required planning, funding, care, and maintenance. And like all infrastructure, when it was no longer needed, it was abandoned. But the bird, unlike a road or a bridge, could not simply remain as a ruin. It returned to being a bird. With no messages to carry, the pigeon quietly folded itself back into obscurity, cooing in attics, nesting in bell towers, fluttering between broken window frames in forgotten cities. We erase them from memory not because they failed us, but because they succeeded so well for so long that we forgot how essential they once were. Civilian life after service. Unlike war horses or military dogs, pigeons rarely had retirement ceremonies. There were no medals for years of government service or faithful dispatch delivery. Most were simply released or repurposed for breeding, or in some cases euthanized when messaging programs were shut down. Only a few exceptional pigeons like Cher Ami or Gustav, a D-Day messenger awarded the Dickin Medal, were memorialized. But what about the thousands of anonymous birds that carried updates about grain shortages in 10th century Baghdad, or troop positions during the Siege of Kut in World War I? What of the birds that died mid-flight, shot down or exhausted, or intercepted by falcons trained for war? They are gone, of course, their names never recorded, their roots erased by time, and yet their impact remains woven into the outcomes of wars, the preservation of cities, the survival of units. Forgotten heroes, feathered and uncelebrated. Cultural remnants, traces in literature and memory. Although the pigeon is rarely mentioned in great histories, its traces remain in language and myth. The idea of the carrier pigeon persists in language, even if most people today have never seen one. In some cultures, pigeon messages became metaphors for love, fate, or divine signs. In literature, the pigeon occasionally appears as a symbol of dependable innocence, a humble bearer of truth in a noisy world. In Turkish, Arabic, Persian, and Hindi literature, pigeons were often associated with longing and return, a theme drawn directly from their physical behavior. They always came home, no matter the odds, no matter the weather. And so, even as their bureaucratic role faded, their symbolic presence remained a quiet reminder that communication once required living memory. The science they inspired. Interestingly, pigeon messaging systems inspired more than just war tactics. They also sparked interest in navigation, animal cognition, and biogeography. In the 20th century, scientists began asking, how do pigeons do it? How can a bird, no larger than a loaf of bread, find its way across hundreds of miles with no map, no compass, and no prior experience of the route? Theories abounded. Magnetic field sensing. Some researchers believe pigeons use Earth's magnetic field for navigation. Sun positioning. Others propose that they use the angle of the sun, like ancient mariners. Olfactory mapping. A strange but increasingly accepted theory suggests pigeons build a smell map of their environment, associating scents with direction. No single answer satisfies fully. Even today, pigeons remain one of the great mysteries of natural navigation. The infrastructure may be gone, but the curiosity it provoked endures. Lessons from a forgotten network. At a glance, the pigeon messaging system seems quaint, even laughable to a modern mind trained on fiber optics, 5G, and quantum encryption. But beneath the feathers lies a network that reveals enduring truths about how humans adapt, innovate, and survive. Redundancy matters. Even in an age of wires, the pigeon served as a backup, sometimes the only reliable one. Low tech is still tech. The pigeon system was an engineered solution. It required as much planning as any cable network. People trust the familiar. For centuries, rulers continued to fund and use pigeons even after newer tools emerged, not because they didn't understand modernity, but because they understood that trust matters more than novelty. And finally, The pigeon teaches us that even the most boring parts of history, the non-heroic, feather-covered, slow-flight stories, are what kept empires standing. Where are they now? Today, pigeons live mostly in urban anonymity. The very species that once carried secrets of state and saved thousands of lives now begs for crumbs near park benches. They are often called rats with wings, a cruel epithet for a creature that once flew over battlefields with life-saving information. A few countries maintain ceremonial pigeon corps mainly for heritage preservation. Others support pigeon racing communities, where breeding and timing matter more than the message. And scattered across Europe and Asia are aging enthusiasts, quietly keeping the old ways alive not for war, but for the love of tradition. In this way, pigeon messaging survives not in use, but in ritual, in quiet, overlooked corners of culture. A story of human needs and animal service. The history of Pigeon Post is not just a tale of birds. It's a story of human desperation for speed, for connection, for certainty. Whether sending news of a siege, a lover's final words, or the names of Olympic victors, the pigeon carried more than paper. It carried hope. And in that hope, it revealed the fragile backbone of civilization, the need to reach each other reliably across distance and danger. Before encryption, before fiber, before satellites, there was a bird and a message, and the silent trust that it would arrive. Final reflection, the sound of forgotten wings. Close your eyes and imagine it. The beating of wings in the early morning sky, a scroll tied delicately to a foot. Somewhere, someone waiting, not knowing if their words would be heard, not knowing if the message would survive. This was how the world once communicated, with breath held, with faith in instinct, with feathers slicing through wind. No headlines, no monuments, just the soft echo of wings returning home. Next time on Boring History for Sleep, we head to Victorian England, where soap was taxed so heavily that public hygiene nearly collapsed, and the fight to clean one's hands became a quiet rebellion in soapy tubs and factory vats. A nation of dirty shirts. You wake up in London, sometime in the early 1700s. The air smells of coal, damp wool, and something far less dignified, the accumulated sweat of unwashed humanity. You go to clean your face only to find there's no soap. Or rather, there is soap, but it's kept under lock and key. Its purchase is logged. Its sale is taxed. Its manufacture is heavily regulated. Because in 18th century Britain, soap is not just a hygiene product, it is a source of state revenue. And the people? Well, they're left to deal with the consequences. Foul odors, preventable diseases, and the uneasy feeling that cleanliness, like education or voting, might be a privilege rather than a right. The birth of the soap tax. It began in 1712. Parliament, always seeking new revenue streams to fund the War of Spanish Succession, and later, endless colonial campaigns, passed a seemingly simple measure, a duty on soap. But this wasn't a mild tax. It was a deeply bureaucratic, multi-layered system designed to squeeze every possible penny from the process of making soap, not just selling it. Soap manufacturers were required to obtain licenses, pay large deposits, submit to surprise inspections, record every ingredient, batch, and sale. Soap was taxed by weight, not by unit, which meant that dense, high-quality soap was more heavily taxed than lighter blends, encouraging the production of inferior, crumbly, often ineffective soap. Worse, soap was taxed before it was even scented, shaped, or packaged. That meant even soap that was spoiled, unsold, or discarded still generated tax income. This system stayed in place for over 120 years. The effect on soap makers. To comply with the tax, soap makers were required to operate under near-constant surveillance. Customs officers were appointed to each major soap works, often living on site or nearby, with keys to the factory floor. They could enter at will, examine vats, measure outputs, and fine manufacturers for even the smallest deviation in process. Imagine trying to run a small business under those conditions. In one famous case, a soap maker was fined for excess foam, accused of producing untaxed soap from vaporized remnants. Many smaller producers went out of business. Only large companies, those with enough capital to pay the deposits and hire clerks to handle the paperwork, survived. This concentration of soap production had unintended consequences. With fewer producers, the price of soap rose dramatically, especially for good quality varieties. And so the average British citizen began using less soap, sometimes no soap. Class and cleanliness. In a country already riddled with class divisions, the soap tax turned personal hygiene into a class marker. In wealthy homes, soap was a staple. It came in imported boxes from France or Holland, often perfumed and delicately molded. Guests washed before meals. Laundry was boiled. Linen was scrubbed. In working-class neighborhoods, soap was used sparingly. Clothing was aired out but rarely laundered. Faces were wiped, not washed. And full-body bathing, rare unless you were a child in a tin tub once a week, after everyone else had used the same water. And in the poorest slums, especially in rapidly industrializing cities like Manchester, Leeds, and London, soap was virtually non-existent. Water itself was unreliable. Soap, when used, was often stolen, hoarded, or shared between multiple families. Smell, therefore, became a crude but powerful indicator of class. The rich didn't just live better, they smelled better. The poor didn't just suffer more, they reeked of their suffering. This wasn't vanity. This was policy. The government had, by accident or design, made cleanliness a luxury. Disease, poverty, and the cost of filth. In an age before germ theory, many people still believed that bad smells caused disease, a theory known as miasma. But even without full knowledge of bacteria or viruses, the lack of soap had tangible, deadly effects. Outbreaks of cholera, typhus, and dysentery ravaged urban slums throughout the 18th and early 19th centuries. Public health reformers begged Parliament to lower the cost of soap, linking cleanliness directly to disease prevention. In 1837, a medical inspector named William Henry Duncan reported that in the working-class districts of Liverpool, there is no washing of person, no washing of clothing, and little use of soap even where it might be afforded. The poor didn't avoid cleanliness out of laziness or ignorance, they couldn't afford it. Meanwhile, the government continued to profit. The soap lobby and the war for clean hands. By the mid-1800s, opposition to the soap tax began to build. Enter William Lever, later known as Lord Leverhulme, the founder of what would become Unilever. Lever was a soap magnate with a vision: mass-produced, affordable soap for all. But the tax made this nearly impossible. Lever and other industrialists began lobbying Parliament to repeal the duty. They weren't alone. Public health advocates, clergy, doctors, and even some conservative politicians began to see the tax not just as regressive but as dangerous. Pamphlets circulated with titles like Soap and Civilization, a treatise on filth and failure; The Cleanliness Duty, a tax upon morality; The People's Soap, or the Right to Wash. These weren't fringe publications. They reflected a growing cultural understanding that cleanliness was not a luxury. It was essential infrastructure like clean water, sewage, or bread. Still, the Treasury resisted. Soap taxes brought in roughly £1 million per year, a substantial sum in pre-modern budgets. And so the battle dragged on, until public sentiment tipped. Abolishing the soap tax, a quiet revolution. In 1853, after years of public pressure, Chancellor William Gladstone finally repealed the soap tax. It was a quiet line in a larger budget, no dramatic speeches, no public announcement. Just a line struck through. But the effects were immediate. Soap prices dropped by nearly 50%. Small producers returned to the market. Public health campaigns began in earnest. Working-class families could afford to bathe regularly. The tax had been in place for 141 years. Its removal was one of the earliest examples of policy explicitly changed in the name of public health. And while it didn't immediately end the disease outbreaks or eliminate poverty, it gave people a tool to fight back. Cleanliness, for the first time in generations, was accessible. Soap as identity. After the repeal, soap ceased being a symbol of wealth and became a symbol of modernity. Soap was now advertised in newspapers, given away in religious charities, distributed in schools, promoted as a civic virtue. Companies like Lever Brothers capitalized on this shift, launching aggressive marketing campaigns. Sunlight soap became a household name, sold with the slogan, "Cleanliness is next to godliness." But underneath the ads, a deeper shift had occurred. The soap tax's repeal had quietly reshaped national identity. To be British, increasingly, was to be clean, and to be clean was now possible for everyone, not just the wealthy. A tax with a long shadow. Although the soap tax is long gone, its effects lingered. Class associations with smell still persist today. Suspicion of government hygiene policy has deep roots in the tax era. Access to hygiene products remains unequal in many places, globally. It was a cautionary tale. When a basic human necessity is monetized, the cost is paid not just in coin but in health, dignity, and lives. The tax was efficient. It raised money, but it also suppressed public well-being for over a century. All because the state decided that a bar of soap was fair game for revenue. Ending with a quiet lather. Imagine again that small, grimy home in 18th century London. Water heated slowly over a coal stove. Children scrubbed with ashes, not soap. And in the corner, a locked cabinet where the rare bar of tax soap was kept like gold. That was what policy looked like. Not in parliaments or pamphlets, but in basins, bathhouses, and unwashed hands. Now ask yourself, what other things today as essential as soap are taxed, regulated, or withheld in ways that quietly shape how we live, work, or stay healthy? And who still holds the key to the cabinet? Next time on Boring History for Sleep, we shift from British bathtubs to Boston streets, where the Great Molasses Flood of 1919 turned an ordinary winter day into a slow-moving wave of destruction, and one of the strangest disasters in American history. The smell of something about to break. It was a mild Tuesday in Boston, January 15, 1919. The air was slightly warmer than usual, around 40 degrees F, 4 degrees C, unseasonably comfortable for midwinter. Children played on the docks of the North End. Horses pulled carts along Commercial Street. Workers unloaded barrels near the city's busy waterfront. And then a groan, a strange metallic rumble. People described it as sounding like a train wreck, or thunder, or the distant roar of artillery. But what came next was far stranger than noise. From the heart of the Purity Distilling Company's molasses tank, something cracked, then burst, and suddenly 2.3 million gallons of molasses, hot, thick, and dark, exploded outward. A 25-foot wave, moving at speeds estimated up to 35 miles per hour, surged down the narrow city streets. In seconds, buildings crumbled, horses were swept away, and people disappeared into what witnesses later described as a brown tsunami. The Great Molasses Flood, as it came to be known, would kill 21 people, injure more than 150 others, and leave behind a sticky legacy of blame, bad engineering, and bureaucratic indifference. But the roots of this bizarre disaster were older and stickier than that single winter day. Molasses in the machine. Why was there so much molasses in Boston in the first place? Because molasses in 1919 was more than a baking ingredient. It was a commodity of empire, and in many ways it was the crude oil of the colonial Atlantic world. Molasses was shipped from the Caribbean and used to make rum. Rum was shipped to Africa in exchange for slaves. Slaves were then sent to produce more molasses on sugar plantations. This infamous triangular trade gave molasses its dark legacy. But by the early 20th century, it had found a new industrial use as a base ingredient for munitions. Molasses contains sugar, and sugar can be fermented into ethanol, a key component in the manufacture of explosives. During World War I, ethanol demand soared, and the Purity Distilling Company, a subsidiary of United States Industrial Alcohol, USIA, ramped up production at its Boston facility. In 1915, to accommodate this demand, USIA built a 50-foot-tall steel tank near Commercial Street capable of holding over 2 million gallons of molasses. It was intended to store shipments arriving by boat before being piped to a distillery in Cambridge. But the tank was hastily constructed, poorly inspected, and located in the middle of a busy neighborhood. In hindsight, it was a recipe for disaster. In 1919, it became one. Warning signs, groans in the steel. From the very beginning, the tank had problems. Residents of the North End reported hearing groans, leaks, and strange noises from the tank as early as 1916. Children would scoop leaking molasses from the seams, and locals joked that the tank leaked so much, you didn't have to buy molasses. But this wasn't just neighborhood gossip. In fact, a month before the flood, the tank had been filled to near capacity, a rarity during winter months. USIA was reportedly stockpiling molasses, possibly to avoid new alcohol regulations related to prohibition, which was set to begin in 1920. To make matters worse, the molasses pumped into the tank shortly before the disaster was warmer than the tank's contents. Warm liquid expands, pressure builds, and when combined with defective seams and rivets, catastrophe was inevitable. And yet, no engineer had ever inspected the tank. No city official demanded it. No one, not even USIA, seemed concerned. Until it gave way. 12:40 p.m. the moment it snapped. The collapse came just after lunchtime. At 12:40 p.m., a deep, metallic roar was heard across the North End. Seconds later, the tank exploded outward, not in a small leak, but a total rupture. Eyewitnesses described seeing steel panels blown outward like a flower blooming. The wave of molasses that followed was unimaginable. 25 feet high at its peak, 160 feet wide, barreling through Commercial Street. Over 2,300,000 gallons in total volume, traveling at 30-35 mph. It flattened buildings, including a firehouse whose second floor collapsed under the force. It knocked over train cars. It engulfed people and animals, trapping them in thick, suffocating syrup. It moved fast, but it didn't clear quickly. Unlike water, molasses is 1.5 times as dense and much more viscous. Victims didn't just drown, they were immobilized, asphyxiated, or crushed by debris. The human cost. The flood killed 21 people. Some were employees of the distillery. Others were nearby workers or innocent bystanders. One was a 10-year-old boy named Patsy Ferrara, who had been playing near the tank. Over 150 people were injured, many severely with broken bones, internal injuries, or long-term respiratory damage from inhaling molasses. Dozens of horses died, some from the wave, others put down after being stuck in the syrup. For days after the flood, emergency workers worked with saws, shovels, and pickaxes not to clear wreckage, but to chip through molasses-coated ruins. Firemen, Red Cross workers, Navy personnel, and civilian volunteers waded through waist-deep syrup, sometimes sinking to their knees. Debris floated in slow motion. Every step was an effort. Rescuers had to wipe their tools clean between strokes as the molasses gummed up every mechanism. A city stuck. Cleanup was a logistical nightmare. Fire hydrants were clogged. Drainage systems backed up. Cobblestones were removed and washed individually. Thousands of gallons of molasses were flushed into Boston Harbor, which reportedly remained brown for months. Everything became sticky, even unrelated neighborhoods, as workers and horses tracked molasses across the city. Police stations and train stations reported molasses appearing on doorknobs, floors, and uniforms for weeks. The scent lingered for decades. Long after the streets were cleared, locals claimed they could smell molasses in the summer air. But beyond the physical cleanup came a second flood, one of lawsuits. The trial of the century sticky justice. In the aftermath, United States Industrial Alcohol denied responsibility. They blamed anarchists, claiming the tank had been bombed by Italian radicals, a popular scapegoat at the time. But evidence quickly stacked against them. The tank had never been pressure tested. Leaks were ignored. Complaints were dismissed. No structural engineers were consulted during construction. A class action lawsuit was filed by victims and families. It became one of the longest civil trials in Massachusetts history, lasting over 5 years. In 1925, USIA was found liable. They paid over $600,000 in damages, equivalent to about $10 million today. It was one of the first major legal victories where a corporation was held accountable for industrial negligence, and it set precedent for modern building codes and safety regulations. Molasses in the memory. Today, the Great Molasses Flood is often treated as a curiosity, a bizarre footnote in the annals of American disasters. But behind the sticky strangeness is a sobering truth. The tank wasn't safe. The company didn't care. The victims weren't protected. In many ways, the flood was a perfect metaphor for early 20th century industrial life. Profit prioritized over safety, communities sacrificed for production, and slow, bureaucratic processes unable to prevent fast-moving disaster. The victims weren't swept away by something exotic or foreign. They were killed by a common ingredient, stored recklessly in a city that should have known better. A brown wave, a quiet warning. The Great Molasses Flood reminds us that history isn't always made of grand battles or noble speeches. Sometimes, it's made of neglected tanks, ignored warnings, and slow, heavy consequences. And it forces us to ask, what other tanks, literal or metaphorical, sit just outside our vision, groaning under pressure? What slow disasters are we laughing off until they burst? The city that couldn't wash it off. After the initial cleanup, the smell of molasses lingered for weeks. Summer arrived and the sun warmed Boston's cobblestones, coaxing up the thick, sweet stench again. Locals swore they could still feel it under their boots, despite countless rinsings. Every warm breeze felt like a memory. But the real residue of the flood wasn't in the gutters, it was in the courtrooms, the newspapers, and the psyche of a city forced to reckon with how something so absurd could have been so deadly. The question remained, who was to blame? USIA's defense: deny, distract, deflect. The United States Industrial Alcohol Company, USIA, had everything to lose. The molasses tank had been theirs, the land theirs, the decisions to ignore warning signs theirs. But in the days following the disaster, they issued bold claims. The tank had been sabotaged, possibly by anarchists or union agitators. The structural failure was unforeseeable. They had complied with all existing regulations. It was not just a legal defense, it was a public relations campaign. USIA's lawyers painted themselves as victims of unpredictable terrorism, using the rising fear of Italian anarchist bombings, which had indeed occurred elsewhere during the Red Scare period, to distract from negligence. But evidence mounted quickly. The anatomy of a disaster, what went wrong? An investigation revealed that the molasses tank had never been properly inspected before or after its construction. And its construction had been, to put it mildly, shockingly substandard. The tank's steel was too thin and contained too little manganese, making it brittle. Rivets were improperly installed and had already shown signs of leaking within days of construction. The tank groaned audibly when filled, as reported in neighborhood complaints. Leaks were painted over rather than repaired, not with metal, but with brown paint to hide the seepage visually. In short, the tank was doomed to fail, not by sabotage but by sheer neglect. The lawsuit, Ryan et al. V. United States Industrial Alcohol Co. The class action lawsuit filed by the victims and their families was unprecedented. It combined more than 100 separate claims from deaths, injuries, property damage, and business losses into a single civil suit. The trial began in 1921, lasted 5 years, and involved 920 witnesses. It was one of the longest and most complex trials of its time. Key elements of the case included eyewitness accounts, people who saw the tank ripple and bulge moments before collapse. Engineering testimony. Experts testified that the tank was fundamentally flawed and failed due to basic physics, not terrorism. Survivor trauma. Victims described the flood not as an amusing inconvenience, but as a horror, likening the sensation of being trapped in molasses to suffocation and drowning at once. Documentation. Internal USIA memos showed they knew about structural issues and chose not to act. The verdict, corporate responsibility on trial. In 1925, the court delivered its decision. United States Industrial Alcohol was liable for the disaster. They were ordered to pay $600,000 in damages, roughly $10 million today. Families of those killed received approximately $7,000 each, not a small sum for the time, but hardly a fortune. Businesses and property owners also received compensation. What made this case significant wasn't just the money, it was the precedent. It was one of the first times in American history where a corporation was held legally accountable for widespread civil damages caused by negligence. It marked a subtle shift in how industrial accidents were viewed. They were acts of God or unavoidable costs of progress. They could be systemic failures, rooted in poor oversight and profit-driven shortcuts. Public health, regulation, and the lessons learned. The flood pushed the city of Boston and eventually the state of Massachusetts to tighten building regulations. Engineers were now required to sign off on large storage tanks. Pressure testing became standard before use. Tank construction was added to the list of projects requiring municipal permits and inspections. Insurance companies also began enforcing stricter risk assessments. In this way, the flood quietly ushered in a new era of safety regulation, not through sweeping federal law, but through the slow, deliberate chisel of local policy and civil litigation. The flood did what years of lobbying hadn't. It forced industry to answer for the public consequences of private enterprise. An immigrant community hit hardest. The north end of Boston, where the tank was located, was a predominantly Italian immigrant neighborhood. Many of the dead and injured were dock workers, stall vendors, children, residents of tenement buildings flattened by the wave. Their suffering at the time was easily dismissed by the press and city officials. Another way class and ethnicity played into the aftermath. But in the court case, their voices were heard. For many immigrant families, the compensation money helped them stay in the country, rebuild homes, or relocate. But it didn't erase what had happened. One of the many sad ironies of the flood is that the very people accused of bombing the tank, Italian anarchists, were the same ethnic community most deeply affected by its collapse. The cultural memory, laughter, guilt, and silence. You may wonder, why is this story not better known? Why isn't there a major film, a national monument, or more robust history lessons about it? Several reasons. The name sounds silly. Molasses flood evokes a cartoon, not a tragedy. No famous people died. Most victims were working class, with no connections to power. It competed with bigger headlines. 1919 was a year of global unrest, strikes, and political violence. Molasses itself feels harmless, sweet, slow, and unthreatening. But for decades, local memory preserved the story. Oral histories kept it alive. Children in Boston grew up hearing it. By the late 20th century, it re-emerged in historical journals, public art, and quiet commemorations. Still, for many years, the flood was treated more like trivia than trauma. The plaque in the street. In 2016, the Boston Parks Department installed an official plaque at the site of the disaster. It reads, "On January 15, 1919, a molasses tank at 529 Commercial Street exploded under pressure, killing 21 people. A 40-foot wave of molasses buckled the elevated railroad tracks, crushed buildings, and inundated the neighborhood. Structural defects in the tank, combined with unseasonably warm temperatures, contributed to the disaster." It's a quiet marker, easy to miss. But for historians, urban planners, and anyone interested in the mechanics of civic failure, it's sacred ground. And nearby, Commercial Street still hums with activity. Tourists walk by. Food vendors set up carts. Few notice the legacy beneath their feet. But some say that on very hot days, you can still smell molasses in the air, a sweet, ghostly reminder of when safety gave way to sugar, and a city was nearly drowned in syrup. The slowest disaster, the fastest consequences. We often imagine disasters as sudden earthquakes, fires, bombings, but the Great Molasses Flood was a slow disaster in the making. It built up silently, rivet by rivet, corner cut by corner cut, until gravity did what regulators would not. That's what makes it such a modern story. It wasn't about molasses. It was about the invisible forces that build in flawed systems, the cheapness of working-class lives, the ease of blaming the outsider, the delays in justice when power sits at the defendant's table. It is a story as much about how we fail to act as it is about how things fall apart. A drip still echoing. Even now, the molasses flood remains a case study in law schools, engineering courses, and urban planning programs. It's cited in textbooks on negligence, manuals on pressure tank design, courses on industrial regulation. Its sweet absurdity makes it memorable. Its bitter truths make it necessary. And so we are left with one question. What disasters today move slowly, too slowly to alarm us until, at last, the pressure is too much, and something breaks? Cleaning the last drop. It took weeks to clear the molasses from Boston streets. Hundreds of workers scraped, mopped, and hosed down every surface. Salt water from the harbor was pumped through fire hoses. Sand was spread to absorb the syrup before being shoveled up like snow. Yet the residue clung to everything. Tools stuck, hinges groaned, gloves peeled off with effort. Reporters arriving in the North End to cover the cleanup reportedly had their notebooks stick shut before they could file stories. The molasses had seeped into the wood grain of buildings, the gaps in cobblestones, the cracks of foundation walls. It was everywhere and nowhere at once, thick, slow, almost defiant. And when workers finally finished, they carried the scent home with them. Literally. Their clothes, their hair, even their skin carried a sweetness that wouldn't go away. For weeks, the Red Cross and fire departments used vinegar and baking soda in fruitless attempts to break down the sugar. The city may have cleaned its streets, but the memory stuck. The smell, sickly sweet, slightly fermented, would become the unofficial ghost of the North End. Boston moves on slowly. In the years following the flood, Boston changed. The North End remained a working-class, heavily Italian neighborhood, but slowly modernized. New construction projects altered the landscape. The elevated train line that had been twisted by the molasses was rebuilt and eventually removed. A generation passed. By the 1950s, few talked about the flood in any serious way. The legal case had closed. The victims were largely gone, and molasses, once a central industrial product, had been replaced by more modern sweeteners and more volatile fuels. It became a local legend, one that sounded absurd the first time you heard it, but it wasn't fiction. There was no museum, no memorial, just stories passed down, and for many years those stories weren't told at all. Rediscovery in the archives. The molasses flood experienced a revival of public interest in the 1970s and 80s, thanks in part to urban historians and journalists who dug through archival newspapers, trial transcripts, and engineering reports. What they found wasn't just a story of molasses. It was a microcosm of modernity, the tensions between private profit and public safety, between urban growth and government oversight. Suddenly, the molasses flood was being cited in engineering ethics courses, business liability training, urban planning debates, science writing on fluid dynamics. Yes, really. Even physicists got involved. In 2016, researchers at Harvard published an analysis using the flood to study non-Newtonian fluid behavior, how a material like molasses behaves under stress, and how it transitions from a liquid to a semi-solid depending on temperature and speed. The data was real. The consequences were deadly, but the tragedy had been buried under the weight of its own absurdity. Now it was being taken seriously. Molasses as metaphor. It's easy to joke about the flood. Journalists, even today, will reference it with puns. The slowest disaster in American history. A sticky situation. Boston's sweet catastrophe. But the humor masks deeper questions. How do we measure responsibility in the face of systemic negligence? What role does memory play in public safety? How do we balance progress with protection? The molasses flood, in all its bizarre imagery, forces us to reckon with how unglamorous disaster really is. There were no villains in black hats, no obvious heroes, just a collapsing tank, ignored warnings, and lives lost to a slow-moving brown wave. It's absurd, but that's what makes it so terrifying. Because if something as simple as molasses could kill 21 people and flatten a city block, what else might we be ignoring today? Echoes in other places. Boston was not the only city to suffer from slow disasters. In 1947, Texas City exploded when a ship full of ammonium nitrate caught fire due to lax port regulations. In 1979, Mississauga, Ontario, experienced a train derailment and chemical spill that nearly led to a massive urban evacuation. In 1984, Bhopal, India, suffered the worst industrial disaster in history when a pesticide plant leaked gas, killing thousands. Each of these events had their own warning signs. Each was written off until it was too late. Each involved systems built too quickly, managed too loosely, and trusted too much. Like Boston in 1919, they were places where infrastructure outpaced insight. What we forget when we don't remember. By now, the molasses flood has entered pop culture. It's been the subject of children's books, satirical poems, documentaries, comedy sketches, animated shorts. But outside of Boston, it's often told as a quirky side note, history's strangest accident. And perhaps that's the danger. Because strange things, when not understood, get dismissed, and dismissed things don't get prevented. Absurdity is no shield against repetition. The molasses flood should not be remembered as a joke. It should be remembered as a warning that even the most mundane materials, when mixed with corporate carelessness and weak oversight, can become agents of tragedy. A final sticky reckoning. The tank that exploded on January 15, 1919, had stood for just 4 years. No memorial exists at its exact footprint, but its outline is still visible literally. Today, if you walk through Boston's Langon Park, you can find a section of sidewalk with a steel ring embedded into the concrete marking the diameter of the original tank. It's not a tourist attraction. There's no fence around it. You might step over it without even knowing. And yet, beneath your feet lies one of the clearest examples in American history of what happens when industry is left unchecked. It didn't take a revolution. It didn't take a riot. It took a warm winter day and a tank that should have been built better. The ghost in the sweetness. There's something haunting about a disaster that smells sweet. Survivors said they could taste the air for days, that they dreamed of syrup, that the scent of molasses made them sick for years afterward. It wasn't just the deaths, it was the violation of normalcy. How could something as domestic as molasses, a baking ingredient, a breakfast condiment, become a weapon? How could a company selling sweetness deliver such destruction? That's the lesson. Danger isn't always loud. It isn't always fast. Sometimes it's stored in plain sight behind thin steel walls, waiting for a warm day and a bit of pressure. Final reflection: what we choose to build. In the end, the molasses flood was about decisions. Decisions made for profit, decisions not made in time, and decisions remembered too late. The decision to skip engineering tests. The decision to ignore neighborhood complaints. The decision to locate a volatile tank in a crowded district. The decision to paint over leaks instead of fix them. Small decisions, invisible at the time, but all of them mattered. And that perhaps is the real story, not the molasses, not the flood, but the slow accumulation of choices that made it inevitable. So we ask, what are we building today that we haven't truly tested? What are we ignoring because it seems too absurd to take seriously? What forgotten tanks are waiting to burst in our own cities? Next time on Boring History for Sleep, we return to the quiet countryside of revolutionary France, where something even more controversial than kings and guillotines was being forced on the people: the metric system, and how a nation that executed monarchs still refused to change the way they measured flour. The most rational revolution. The French Revolution is often remembered for grand gestures: the storming of the Bastille, the tennis court oath, the execution of Louis XVI, and of course, the Reign of Terror, all dramatic, bloody hallmarks of a country attempting to remake itself from scratch. But in the quieter offices of the National Assembly, another revolution was brewing, one that aimed to destroy the old system of weights and measures. It was bold, logical, rational. It was also deeply unpopular. And unlike the guillotine, which most peasants came to fear but understand, the metric system inspired a very different kind of response: confusion, resentment, quiet sabotage. Because in the end, for the average French villager in 1795, it was not the fall of the monarchy that made daily life unbearable. It was trying to figure out how many new grams of flour they needed to bake bread. France before the meter. To understand the revolution in measurement, we must first understand just how messy and inconsistent things were in pre-revolutionary France. Before 1795, France operated on over 250,000 different units of measurement. These included regional feet and local inches, customary bushels and municipal toises, weirdly specific trade measures like the pint de Paris, a kind of liquid pint, which varied by town. Even different definitions for the same unit, depending on whether it was applied to wheat, wine, or salt. A foot in Bordeaux wasn't the same as a foot in Marseille. A pound in Lyon could weigh more or less than a pound in Lille. Measuring land. You better know if it's in arpents, journals, or boiso and which version. Merchants cheated, intentionally or not. Peasants couldn't verify. Tax collectors benefited from the chaos. In short, inconsistency was power, and that power belonged to the cities, the bureaucrats, and the nobility. Enlightenment by the numbers. By the late 18th century, France's scientific elite had had enough. The Enlightenment demanded universal systems knowledge that could be verified, shared, and repeated. The patchwork of traditional measurements was, to thinkers like Condorcet, Lavoisier, and Talleyrand, not just inefficient, it was medieval. So in 1790, amidst the early glow of revolutionary optimism, the Académie des Sciences proposed a new system, one based not on tradition or locality, but on the natural world. The meter, 1/10,000th of the distance from the equator to the North Pole, measured along a meridian through Paris. The kilogram, the weight of 1 liter of water at its freezing point. The second, derived from dividing the Earth's rotation. No kings, no gods, just earth, water, and time. It was beautiful, clean, elegant. And it made no sense at all to most of the country. The metric law of 1795. On April 7, 1795, the French government passed the law of the decimal metric system, officially abolishing the old units. All commerce was to use meters, centimeters, and millimeters for length, grams and kilograms for weight, liters for volume. Everything was now base 10, rational decimal. But implementation was optimistic. Peasants and rural merchants, already skeptical of Parisian elites, now had to learn entirely new units with no real context. They didn't have scales calibrated in grams. They didn't know what a kilogram of wheat felt like. Their hands and eyes were trained in pinches, handfuls, and the weight of a sack carried on their back. Worse, many saw the change as a trick, a new way for the government to confiscate grain, collect taxes, or cheat at markets. They weren't entirely wrong. Confusion in the countryside. In 1795, less than 25% of French citizens were literate. Even fewer had any experience with scientific measurement. So when merchants arrived at rural markets and declared that old pounds were banned, and now everything was in kilograms, panic ensued. In small towns, markets were abandoned. Arguments erupted over the scale. Farmers refused to sell grain, fearing deception. Millers sabotaged their own equipment to avoid compliance. There are recorded instances of villagers throwing stones at government inspectors who tried to enforce metric use. In the Dordogne, a tax collector was chased out of town when he demanded flour be measured in liters. "This is a butcher's trick," one woman reportedly screamed, "and I will not give my lamb for an unknown number." To these communities, the metric system wasn't a scientific marvel. It was another Parisian imposition, like conscription, taxes, or church closures. And the government, it did what revolutionary governments often did when faced with noncompliance. It made compliance mandatory by force. The role of the gendarmerie. To enforce the new metric system, the revolutionary government deployed the gendarmerie state police to markets and towns. Their job was to inspect scales, confiscate illegal weights and measures, fine and sometimes imprison violators, teach the new system with little patience. In some areas, these officials were called les hommes des poids, the men of the weights. They were deeply unpopular. To many, they were worse than tax collectors because they tampered with daily life. Where taxes took your income, the metric system took your understanding. It made people feel stupid, lost, disempowered. And when they resisted, they were treated as counter-revolutionaries, even if they were just trying to measure cheese the way they always had. A rural revolt in the shadow of a revolution. This conflict between the rationality of reform and the reality of rural life played out across thousands of villages, but it never made headlines. Why? Because it wasn't dramatic, it wasn't bloody, it wasn't revolutionary in the conventional sense, it was boring. It was a man refusing to buy grain because he didn't trust the new scale, a woman baking bread by feel instead of by gram, a tax official ignoring complaints because he, too, didn't understand the new system. It was, in short, bureaucratic rebellion, slow, passive, and pervasive. And for a revolution that claimed to speak for the people, this posed a problem. The people weren't cooperating. The temporary repeal. By 1812, nearly 2 decades after the system's introduction, resistance remained strong. Even under Napoleon, France's most powerful autocrat, metric adoption had stalled. So in a rare moment of pragmatism, Napoleon issued the Measures Usuals decree, a compromise system that reintroduced traditional names, like pounds and feet, but recalibrated them to align with metric values. For example, the new pound was exactly 500 grams. The new foot was 1/3 of a meter. This hybrid system allowed people to use familiar terms, while slowly transitioning them toward metric values. It was clever, quiet, and relatively successful. But the full conversion wouldn't be complete for another 50 years. A quiet triumph of time. By the late 19th century, France had finally fully adopted the metric system, not through mandates or punishments, but through generational replacement. Children learned grams and meters in school. Merchants replaced old scales. Travelers grew tired of converting between towns. And eventually, the system that had once sparked outrage became mundane. What began as a forced measure became habit. The legacy of resistance. Today, France is proudly metric, and yet the memory of resistance lingers. Even now, in rural markets, you'll hear older vendors refer to livers and pouces, not because they reject the metric system, but because they remember a time when change came not with clarity, but with confusion. The metric system's history in France is often celebrated as a triumph of Enlightenment logic, but it's also a case study in how top-down reform, even when scientifically valid, can fail utterly if it doesn't meet people where they live. What Paris called progress, the countryside experienced as alienation. And it makes you wonder, how many other rational reforms throughout history were quietly rejected not because they were wrong, but because they were unfamiliar. The revolution that arrived without instructions. By the time the metric system was officially implemented in 1795, France had already endured years of chaos, revolution, regicide, famine, war, the terror, and a total upheaval of social and religious life. People were exhausted. Into this fray came la réforme des poids et mesures, the reform of weights and measures sold as a gift of reason and equality. The government saw it as a symbol of modern civilization. But in the eyes of many, it was just another abstract decree from distant Paris, delivered without guidance, tools, or even explanation. Farmers didn't receive charts, merchants weren't given scales, bakers weren't taught how to convert livers to kilograms, and even if they were, most couldn't read them anyway. The metric system was a brilliant idea communicated terribly. And when people don't understand a rule, they find ways to ignore it, bend it, or quietly break it. Fake compliance, real confusion. In towns and villages across France, the first years of metric enforcement created a strange kind of dual economy. Bakers would sell kilogram loaves that were really old 1-pound loaves with new labels. Butchers would weigh meat using old scales, but adjust the price to metric units however they chose. Farmers would sell grain in sacks labeled 50 kilograms, even if they still filled them by eye and feel. Local scribes and notaries would often translate contracts into traditional units, or just leave them ambiguous. To outsiders, it looked like compliance. To the people on the ground, it was just business as usual in disguise. This was not resistance in the form of revolution. It was the resistance of indifference. They didn't riot. They didn't protest. They just kept doing what they always had until the government got tired of fighting them. The market as a battleground. Rural markets were where this tension played out most visibly. These were central gathering places not just for goods, but for gossip, politics, and social life. Before the metric system, buyers and sellers relied on trust and experience. A butcher's scale might be slightly off, but everyone in the village knew him. A miller might measure flour by the bowl, not the gram, but his prices were consistent. The arrival of standardized measures certified, abstract, impersonal undermined local relationships. A man who used the wrong weight could now be fined, even if his customers were happy. This caused tension not just between peasants and officials, but among neighbors. Some shopkeepers eagerly adopted metric tools, hoping to gain favor with authorities. Others saw them as traitors or snobs. Arguments erupted over who was being accurate, a concept that suddenly had legal meaning. Markets became sites of measurement anxiety. The units were changing, but so was something deeper, how trust worked. The problem of touch. Most rural peasants measured the world with their hands. A handful of seeds, a pinch of salt, a sack of flour, a stick's length of rope, a shoulder load of firewood. These measures weren't abstract. They were tied to the body, human, relational, tactile. The metric system, by contrast, was based on standardized artifacts. A meter bar, a liter vessel, a calibrated weight. All needed to be manufactured, distributed, certified. All were external to the user. For many, this made the system feel alien and untrustworthy. How could a unit defined by a government in Paris possibly be more correct than what one's hand had always known? The answer, of course, is that it could be, but that didn't make it convincing. The language of resistance. Even when people adopted the metric units, they often used old words to describe them. A liver pound might now refer to 500 grams, not the old 489.5 g. A toy's fathom might casually mean 2 meters, instead of 1.949 m. Pint, quart, and setier lived on even when the physical measures had changed. This linguistic persistence created a shadow metric system technically compliant, but culturally disconnected. Government officials complained in letters and reports. The peasant refers to the kilogram, yet continues to measure with his thumb. He buys by the liter, but fills the jug by memory. This was not simply resistance. It was reinterpretation, the process by which people translate reform into the terms they understand, even if those terms contradict the reform itself. The hybrid era, 1812–1837. Napoleon's decree of measures usuals, customary measures, in 1812 was an attempt to meet people halfway. Rather than fight the old names, the state co-opted them, aligning them with metric standards. 1 liver equals 500 grams. 1 toys equals 2 meters. 1 pint equals 1 liter. This created a bilingual system, metric by law, traditional by language. For 25 years, it worked fairly well. People used names they trusted, while slowly internalizing new values. But by 1837, France reversed course again. The metric system was made exclusive and compulsory, effective January 1, 1840. The final push had begun. The true shift, generational replacement. The real success of metrication didn't come from fines, force, or Napoleonic compromise. It came from time. As schools expanded in the 1830s and 1840s, children began learning metric units from their earliest days. Government-printed primers, arithmetic books, and lesson plans were all in meters and grams. Parents may have still measured flour by the handful, but their children were learning in tens, hundreds, and thousands. In rural towns, blacksmiths, bakers, and builders slowly replaced old tools with metric-calibrated ones, not because they were forced, but because suppliers stopped making the old kind. Over a generation, familiarity replaced fear. What was once strange became normal. It's easy to underestimate this kind of change, but it may be the only kind that works in the long run. The final holdouts. Despite these shifts, pockets of resistance remained well into the late 19th century. Some communities used hybrid systems well into the 1870s. Even by the 1880s, government inspectors were still reporting illegal units in local markets, especially in mountain towns, isolated farming regions, and border areas. But by then, resistance had lost its sharpness. It was nostalgic, not defiant. A woman who sold cheese by the old pound was no longer breaking the law, she was performing a memory. The measurement had become ceremonial, like a grandmother's recipe that doesn't quite match the modern cookbook and doesn't need to. Rationality isn't always reasonable. Historians now look back at France's metrication as a success story, but it came at the cost of misunderstanding, mistrust, and decades of unacknowledged frustration. What it teaches us is this: reform, even when scientifically superior, is not self-justifying. Rationality imposed without empathy becomes just another form of coercion. And systems, to survive, must become invisible part of the cultural background, not the political foreground. By 1900, most French citizens measured in meters, weighed in kilos, and filled by liters without thinking about it. That was the true revolution, not the law of 1795, but the moment people stopped noticing. A question of modern measures. As we consider our own time, we might ask, what reforms today are being resisted, not because they're wrong, but because they're unfamiliar? What systems are failing, not in content but in communication? And how many of our daily habits are shaped not by logic, but by feel, memory, and trust? The metric system in France was never just about math. It was about how people measure life and how long it takes to change that. From French fields to the wider world. By the late 19th century, France had largely succeeded in implementing the metric system. Its laws were enforced, its units understood, and its weights trusted, not because of revolution, but because resistance had simply aged out. Children raised in the new system no longer questioned it. Markets adapted, factories standardized, and most importantly, other countries began to follow. But this wasn't a sudden victory. It was a slow domino effect, as much about colonialism, commerce, and convenience as it was about reason. Metrication by empire. France, like other European powers, was busy expanding its colonial footprint in the 19th century in North Africa, Indochina, and West Africa. The metric system traveled with it. Colonial administrators imposed metric standards for taxation, especially land and harvests; trade goods, rubber, palm oil, spices; infrastructure, roads, railways, irrigation systems; census and population records. But just like in rural France, these units often made no sense to local people. In Algeria, for instance, peasants resisted the use of liters for olive oil and kilograms for wheat, insisting on ancient local units like the oka and the mud. In Vietnam, the metric system was used by law, but local markets often continued to use traditional East Asian measures. The story repeated. Metrication was official, but only real once it passed through lived experience. Even in empire, metric compliance was as much cultural as legal. The industrial age and the need for standardization. The 19th century also brought the Industrial Revolution: machines, mass production, railroads, and international trade. Suddenly, precise and universal measurements mattered more than ever. A screw made in Lyon needed to fit a bolt in Leipzig. A barrel of oil shipped from Marseille needed to be priced the same in Cairo or Dakar. A factory blueprint drafted in meters was easier to replicate than one in toises and pies. Metrication began to accelerate not just because governments insisted on it, but because machines required it. This was the great shift. Human hands gave way to calibrated parts, and parts required precision. So even the old resistors millers, smiths, bakers began to accept metric units, not because they loved them, but because their tools did. The odd case of Britain and the United States. France's metrication became a model for much of the world, but not for everyone. The two most prominent holdouts. The United Kingdom. The United States. In Britain, resistance was rooted in national pride and pragmatism. The imperial system feet, stones, furlongs was deeply embedded in daily life, law, and engineering. While metric units were adopted in science and some industries, public life remained comfortably imperial. In the U.S., the story was different, chaotic, even. In 1866, the U.S. Congress legalized the metric system for trade, but didn't require it. Over time, scientists adopted metric standards. The military used hybrid systems. Schools taught metric alongside imperial. Packaging listed both grams and ounces. Yet the public clung to miles, pounds, and gallons out of habit, culture, and inertia. And so, even into the 21st century, the U.S. and Britain remain among the few countries not fully metric, a curious legacy of cultural resistance to rational reform. Sound familiar? When people feel replaced, they resist. What ties together these global stories, from French peasants to Algerian olive growers to modern American carpenters, is not simply a fear of math. It's the feeling that one's knowledge is being invalidated. Imagine you've spent a lifetime learning how to measure grain with your hand, how to judge firewood by the armload, how to trade by eye. Then suddenly a government says, "This is all wrong. We've invented something better. You must now do it our way." Even if our way is scientifically superior, it's also socially alien. And worse, it often comes with no support, no training, and no patience. So people resist not just out of stubbornness, but to defend their dignity. They're not rejecting reason, they're rejecting replacement. The metric system today. Today, the metric system is used officially in almost every country in the world. It governs international trade, scientific research, medicine and health, construction and engineering, education and legal definitions. But the ghosts of resistance remain. In parts of rural India, traditional land measures like the bigha and canal are still common. In the UK, people still speak of miles, pints, and stones even if their passports list height in centimeters. In the US, recipes list cups and tablespoons, not grams and milliliters. Metrication succeeded legally, structurally, globally, but culturally it's still a work in progress. The triumph of boredom. And yet, perhaps the most telling sign of the metric system's success is that no one thinks about it anymore. In France today, children grow up with kilometers on road signs, liters on milk cartons, Celsius in weather reports, centimeters in school rulers, grams in recipe books. The old units are gone, not outlawed, but forgotten. The revolution succeeded not when the people understood, but when they stopped noticing. That is how true systems work. They disappear into normal life. Final reflections, the slowness of change. Looking back, the resistance to the metric system is not a story of backwardness or ignorance. It's a story of time, trust, and the limits of top-down reform. The peasants weren't stupid, they just needed Time to adapt. Familiar words to bridge old and new. Trust in the people delivering the change. And tools that fit their hands, not just the law. Reformers often forget. People measure life in meaning, not meters. And meaning cannot be imposed. It must be lived, shared, and eventually inherited. A final question. So the next time you pour a liter of water or walk a kilometer, remember, these were once radical ideas. They disrupted markets, confused bakers, and sparked quiet rebellion across a revolution-weary France. They won not by force, but by waiting for habits to shift, generations to pass, and hands to forget how much a pound used to weigh. And it makes you wonder, what parts of your world feel eternal now, but were once resisted, ridiculed, or feared? Next time on Boring History for Sleep, we move from measuring grains to counting the dead with a quiet and tragic story about how 19th century Londoners handled death during cholera epidemics, and the strange men who mapped the graves before the bodies were even buried. A city that couldn't bury its dead. By the 1830s, London was the largest city on Earth, a sprawling, soot-covered metropolis of over 2 million people. But as the city ballooned in size, it faced a deeply unspeakable problem. It was running out of places to put the dead. Graveyards were overstuffed. Parish churchyards were piled high, with bodies layered atop bodies, often no more than a foot or two beneath the surface. Bones surfaced during rainstorms. Dogs dug them up. Children played over shallow graves. The dead spilled out into the living world, and the city began to panic. It wasn't just gruesome, it was dangerous. Because to most Londoners, death smelled like disease, and in the cholera-sick summers, that stench was inescapable. The rise of cholera. Cholera arrived in London in 1832, and again in 1848, 1854, and 1866, killing tens of thousands with each wave. The disease struck quickly. Diarrhea, vomiting, dehydration, and death often within 48 hours. But no one knew what caused it. Doctors blamed miasma, bad air, foul odors, the general stink of urban life. They believed that the smell of decay, especially from graveyards and cesspits, spread disease. To prevent it, they tried to seal the stench, fumigate homes, and even burn aromatic herbs in the streets. What they didn't realize yet was that cholera was a waterborne disease caused by the bacterium Vibrio cholerae, spread through contaminated drinking water. Still, in the absence of modern germ theory, the city focused on what it could see and smell. And what it saw was horrifying. Graveyards as civic crisis. By the 1840s, many churchyards had become vertical mass graves. The same ground might hold dozens of paupers in a common trench, corpses stacked without coffins, bodies hastily covered with lime to speed decomposition, reinterred bones displaced by new burials. One observer in 1842 wrote of a churchyard in Holborn. I saw the graves open, corpses lying within a foot of the surface. One could scarcely take a step without stepping on some part of the dead. And this was not uncommon. In some parishes, burials exceeded 1,000 per year in a single acre. Water wells were dug dangerously close to graveyards. Open graves festered in the summer heat. The smell of death, what the Victorians called the miasma of putrefaction, hung over entire neighborhoods. It was in this fetid, gasping environment that a quiet kind of hero emerged. The grave mapper. Men of the map. They weren't famous. They weren't always welcome. And yet, in the face of civic neglect, a small group of surveyors, inspectors, and amateur demographers took it upon themselves to do something no one had thought to do. Count the dead. Map the graves. Show with data the scale of the crisis. These men, many working under or inspired by the General Board of Health, founded in 1848, began visiting the worst urban burial grounds in London, not to bury bodies, but to record them. They measured churchyards down to the square foot, estimated total burial based on parish registers, mapped burial density by year, noted proximity to houses, wells, and schools, recorded anecdotal horrors: coffins split open, corpses unearthed, bodies stacked too deep. The maps were not artistic. They were meticulously boring tables, ledgers, surveyors' notes, hand-drawn sketches. But they told a terrifying story. There were tens of thousands more corpses beneath the city than anyone wanted to admit. The work of Edwin Chadwick. One of the key figures in this movement was Edwin Chadwick, a lawyer and social reformer who led a groundbreaking inquiry into urban sanitation. In 1842, Chadwick published his now famous report on the sanitary condition of the laboring population of Great Britain. In it, he devoted entire chapters to the problem of urban burial grounds. Drawing on maps, witness testimony, and death records, he revealed that many churchyards held twice as many bodies as their volume could permit. Decomposition: gases were venting into homes and streets. Cholera deaths clustered near graveyards. The report didn't prove that graveyards caused cholera. Science hadn't caught up yet, but it connected the dots in a way the public could understand. More importantly, Chadwick used the dry, slow, bureaucratic language of measurement maps, counts, footnotes to make horror legible. He didn't cry out, he calculated. And Parliament noticed. The push for reform. In the wake of Chadwick's report, the British government began to act. It passed the Burial Act of 1852, authorizing the closure of overcrowded inner-city graveyards, the construction of new cemeteries outside city limits, the creation of death registries and burial permits, the empowerment of inspectors of burial grounds. By 1854, new garden cemeteries like Highgate, Kensal Green, and Nunhead had been built, expansive, landscaped, and modern. The dead were finally being given space. But perhaps more crucially, the living began to understand that death, if not managed properly, could become a civic disease. And that understanding came not through panic, but through mapping. The unsung labor of the ledger. We don't know the names of all the men who measured graves. They were often hired clerks, part-time surveyors, or municipal assistants working in anonymity. They trudged through mud, decay, and fumes with clipboards and measuring tape, not swords or sermons. But their work, the slow, deliberate, painstaking measurement of rot, was foundational. They didn't discover germ theory. They didn't invent modern plumbing. They didn't cure cholera. But they made it possible for others to do so. Because sometimes, the most important truths in history are not revealed with trumpets but tables, footnotes, and a sketch of a graveyard fence. An open grave, an unanswered question. And so, by the time John Snow would trace cholera to a water pump in 1854, and by the time London built its great sewer system under Joseph Bazalgette in the 1860s, the ground had already been prepared literally and figuratively by the grave mappers. They turned death into data. They made absence visible. And they asked a question that echoes even now. How do we build a city for the living when the dead refuse to stay buried? After the grave, paperwork as a public health tool. By the middle of the 19th century, London's graveyards had begun to close not by protest or divine decree, but by administrative order. Under the Burial Acts passed between 1852 and 1857, cemeteries in densely populated urban parishes were declared full, unsafe, or unsanitary. But closing graveyards was only the beginning. If the 1840s had been about discovering the problem, the 1850s and 60s were about controlling it, not by digging up the past, but by regulating the future. Enter the burial permit. For the first time in London's history, you could not legally bury a body without official permission. And to get that permission, someone, a family member, parish clerk, or funeral director had to register the death, declare the cause, present it to the local inspector, ensure burial occurred in an approved cemetery. It was a slow, sober, and entirely bureaucratic process. But it transformed how death entered the civic record. The rise of the registrar of deaths. Before this shift, many burials went unrecorded. Poor families often buried their dead in paupers' graves with no headstone, no record, no ceremony. Stillbirths and infant deaths might be handled privately. Epidemic victims could be dumped in hurriedly dug trenches. But after the Registration Act of 1836, and especially after the Burial Act of 1852, the role of the Registrar of Deaths became critical. Each registrar kept detailed logs, names, ages, occupations, cause of death, date of burial, place of burial. These were maintained in leather-bound ledgers, often handwritten, and submitted to local boards of health or burial committees. It was dull work. There were no headlines, but over time, these ledgers revealed patterns that no doctor, preacher, or politician could. Clusters of infant mortality, patterns of cholera recurrence, geographic overlaps between poverty and early death, seasonal peaks in death rates tied to poor sanitation or extreme weather. The ledger became a mirror for the city, reflecting not just where the dead lay, but why they died. The return of the map, John Snow and the Broad Street Pump. Perhaps the most famous example of death data in action came in 1854, during another terrifying cholera outbreak in Soho. By this point, Dr. John Snow, a London physician, had begun to suspect that cholera wasn't spread by miasma, bad air, but by contaminated water. When dozens died in the area around Broad Street, Snow investigated using methods that were for the time remarkably novel. He created a dot map, placing a mark on each household where a death had occurred. He overlaid this with the locations of water pumps in the area. The pattern was clear. Most deaths were clustered around one pump. Snow removed the pump handle. The outbreak slowed. While his theory of waterborne disease wasn't immediately accepted, his methodology, counting, mapping, visualizing, changed everything. For the first time, a public health crisis had been solved with data, not superstition. Snow's method owed its success to the groundwork laid by grave mappers and registrars, who had normalized the practice of treating death as data. Death in the margins, pauper graves, and class inequality. Despite reforms, not all deaths were treated equally. The new garden cemeteries, beautiful, landscaped, serene, often charged fees. Plots were purchased by the middle and upper classes. Poorer Londoners, especially in East End parishes, were buried in pauper graves. Mass pits containing dozens, sometimes hundreds of bodies. No headstones. Minimal ceremony, often just a prayer. Sometimes delayed burial due to inability to pay. These graves were mapped too, but rarely with care. The records might state: Common Pit, Section 14B, 87 bodies interred between March 3 and March 8. But no names, no markers. For social reformers, this became a second kind of crisis: invisible death, a death that was recorded numerically but not individually. Some burial inspectors began campaigning for reform, demanding memorials for pauper dead, publication of interment lists, better hygiene in trench burials. They failed mostly. The city had limited resources, but their efforts added another layer to the grave mapping project. Not just how many people had died, but who they were and why their deaths had been erased. Data meets design, the cemetery as civic space. With the closure of old churchyards and the expansion of modern cemeteries, London began to reimagine the cemetery as more than a dump for corpses. Highgate Cemetery, opened in 1839, became known for its dramatic tombs, Gothic architecture, and landscape paths. Brompton Cemetery was laid out like a cathedral, without a roof, with central aisles, chapels, and symmetry. Kensal Green, modeled after Père Lachaise in Paris, emphasized dignity and park-like tranquility. But beneath this beauty was a bureaucratic marvel: ordered records, row numbers, plot grids, all managed by cemetery clerks using ledgers, index cards, and maps. The result: a city where the dead were no longer buried chaotically, but systematically. This shift had enormous consequences. Disease outbreaks declined. Sanitation improved. Land use became more efficient. And for the first time, the dead could be found again. You could now visit a registrar's office, give a name and year, and be told exactly where someone was buried, something previously impossible for most of London's poor. The influence beyond London. The practices developed in Victorian London death registration, graveyard closure, burial mapping soon spread to other British cities: Manchester, Liverpool, Birmingham. By the late 19th century, they had also been exported to Dublin and Edinburgh, Sydney, Cape Town, and Bombay under colonial administration. Even New York, where similar issues with overcrowded burials had emerged. Cemeteries became not just places of rest, but repositories of urban history, structured, documented, searchable. Without intending to, the grave mappers had helped invent public health bureaucracy. And they had done it through one of the most overlooked methods in history: counting the quiet, the forgotten profession. Today, the role of burial inspector barely exists. The grave mappers have no statues, no plaques. Most of their names are lost to dusty ledgers in city archives. Their work wasn't glamorous. It involved walking through slush-filled graveyards, measuring plots next to decomposing bodies, sketching crude maps in candlelight, filing complaints that few read. And yet, they changed the city more than many of their more famous contemporaries. They asked, "Where do the dead go?" And from that they revealed, "What kind of city do we want for the living?" An ending in ink. As you listen to this now, the maps they drew are long forgotten. The graveyards they measured have mostly become gardens, parks, or blocks of flats. But every time you walk by an orderly cemetery, with its numbered plots and visible names, you're seeing their legacy. They didn't save lives directly. They made it possible to start doing so. And that raises a question worth asking in any age. Who are the people quietly building the systems we'll one day depend on, and how often do we notice them? A city reorganized around its dead. By the late 19th century, the burial crisis that had once threatened to bury London in disease and despair had largely been resolved not with grand speeches or revolutions, but with the quiet geometry of urban planning. Cemeteries were no longer scattered churchyards wedged between bakeries and alleyways. They were designed, organized, landscaped, and crucially legible. The dead were placed in rows, within sections, inside gated plots, marked by registries and maps. In effect, death had become a form of municipal order. Victorian London had turned from a city trying to hide its dead to one that designated space for them not only physically, but socially, morally, and logistically. This wasn't just about hygiene, it was about identity. The modern cemetery as archive. The new cemeteries, such as Brookwood, opened in 1854, and City of London Cemetery, 1856, didn't just bury bodies. They documented lives. Registrars collected names, professions, causes of death, religions, and even fees paid. Stonecutters inscribed headstones using standardized templates. Cemetery managers created detailed lot maps, indexed by name and date. Offices stored ledgers organized by parish, block, and row. For genealogists today, these archives are gold mines. But in the 19th century, they were novel municipal memory systems born out of crisis. The grave mappers may have started with panic and stench, but their successors built civil infrastructure out of sorrow. Grief made predictable. One of the more quietly revolutionary effects of this system was on the grieving process itself. Before formal cemetery reform, poor families often never knew where loved ones were buried. Bodies could be relocated, disinterred, or crushed by new burials without notice. No burial register meant no legal recognition of the deceased. Mourning became untethered, deeply felt, but logistically disorganized. After reform, every death had a paper trail. Graves had locations and could be visited. Funeral schedules were recorded. The bereaved could plan, return, and remember with confidence. Mourning became not just personal but public and procedural. And while that may sound cold, it actually brought comfort, stability in sorrow. The cemetery, once a site of fear, became a place of ritual, routine, and reflection. The cemetery as social mirror. The records from these new cemeteries began to reflect not just death, but class, race, religion, and migration. Walk through a Victorian cemetery and you'll see elaborate family tombs of the industrial elite, modest headstones of skilled workers and clerks, unmarked corners for the anonymous poor, designated sections for Jewish, Catholic, and nonconformist burials, military rows for soldiers from colonial campaigns, immigrant names clustered in later decades: Irish, Italian, Caribbean. The layout of the dead told you much about the structure of the living. In fact, sociologists would later use cemetery records to trace everything from epidemics to economic mobility, thanks, once again, to the meticulous work of grave registrars and mappers. Influence beyond the grave. The burial mapping efforts of Victorian London had ripple effects across the civic landscape. They helped inspire vital record systems, births, marriages, and deaths, zoning laws that separated industrial and residential areas, urban green space planning. Many cemeteries doubled as parks, public health tracking of disease spread, standardized architectural planning for public institutions, schools, hospitals, prisons. In other words, death taught the city how to live better. Out of chaos came data, out of data came design, and out of design came durability. The human legacy of the grave mappers. Most of the grave mappers never saw themselves as visionaries. They didn't write manifestos. They didn't get statues. They counted bones. They measured yards. They traced rectangles around corpses. But in doing so, they transformed Victorian grief into governance. Their legacies endure in every modern city that tracks vital statistics, maintains orderly public cemeteries, responds to epidemics with maps and logs instead of fear and superstition. It's tempting to call them forgotten, but in reality, they are absorbed into every well-run civic record, every grave that can still be found, every name still spoken by a descendant who found it in a ledger. When the dead taught the living, perhaps what's most remarkable is that this reform worked. London, once the city where the dead choked the living, became a model for urban burial management. By the turn of the 20th century, it had dozens of modern cemeteries, near-complete death registration coverage, plummeting cholera and typhoid rates, a public that no longer feared graveyards. And it did so without war, without riots, and without toppling governments. It succeeded because of incremental, boring, relentless documentation. A death, a name, a map, a plan, over and over until the system worked. Modern echoes. Today, we still rely on systems the grave mappers pioneered, especially during times of crisis. During pandemics like COVID-19, governments used death registries, case mapping, burial tracking in hotspots, electronic equivalents of 19th century ledgers. And once again, clerks, data entry workers, public health officers, the modern heirs to the Victorian grave mapper, quietly ensured that order prevailed over chaos. Their work may not be glamorous, but it is essential. Because every time a system prevents panic, it's worth asking, who made it boring, and how much worse would life be without them? A closing thought. You will likely never visit the archives where the original grave maps were stored. You'll never touch the paper where a clerk in 1853 drew a rectangle and labeled it Pauper Pit B, 43 bodies, lime added. But those lines made your modern world possible. They taught the city how to see itself even when its streets were thick with fog, and its graveyards with rot. And perhaps that's the quiet legacy of the grave mappers. They buried the chaos, so the rest of us could live.